Hello, Tom Kyler here. Today I'm going to show you how I'm going to make this livery using Blender as part of my painting workflow. You can get the paint kit off of the XPilot website, forums, commercial vendors, TOGA Simulation, the general discussion topic. Just click on that, go to the very first post, it's pinned, and you can get the paint kit. Download link is in the very first post. After extracting the paint kit, you'll see a folder with some Photoshop files. You'll see a 3D model.fbx file and a couple of PNG images intended to be used with the Magic Wand selection tool. I don't use these myself, but they're there for anybody who could find a use for them. Alright, examination of this livery shows that we're going to be painting all 5 objects that can be painted. To get a little more familiar with the objects, you can go over to the MU2 Docs Livery Paint Kit page and browse this page and get familiar with the objects and the meshes that make up each object. So step 1, I duplicate the paint kit file and rename it to reflect the livery that I'm going to be painting. I don't like to put multiple liveries in the same Photoshop file, as I find those files become bloated and a little bit tougher to manage layer-wise. Alright, as you can see, I'm working in GIMP, not Photoshop, but I'm going to say Photoshop just because it's easier. So step 2 for me is to create my layer structures in all of my Photoshop files and to make sure the layer structures are always named the same and that they're structured the same. So for painting liveries, I only usually need to work in the albedo folder. I create a top level folder for the tail number, and then underneath that folder, I create all the various color layers that I'm going to need. In this case, the black background, one for the red stripe, one for the white outline for the red stripe, and then another one for the decals, which are to say the tail number and the Mitsubishi logo and things of that nature. Alright, so let's talk about the real challenge of this paint kit. This video is not for beginners. I'm assuming that people who are watching this video know how to use Photoshop and understand the concept of UV mapping. So as you see this example here from the exterior object 5, it's the tip tanks. We've got straight lines on the tip tanks, but you can see the UV maps of those lines are anything but straight, a very difficult shape to figure out. So how do we do that? Well, we're going to use the 3D model that comes with the paint kit. Then we're going to get in Blender and we're going to draw some Bezier curves that mimic all the patterns that we want to paint. Then we're going to use that Bezier to cut the 3D model. That cut 3D model is then going to yield a UV map that we can export. We're going to export that UV map into Photoshop. Now that it's in Photoshop, we can trace over that map with a pen tool. Once we have the pen tool and trace the shapes, we turn it into a selection. We fill that selection with color and export, and boom, Bob's your uncle, we are done. Rinse and repeat for all the other graphic elements, and you have a livery. So let's rewind a bit, take a look at each one of these steps in detail, and see how I did it. Step 1, import the FBX file that comes with the paint kit. Add an image empty to be used as a background image to trace the pattern. Alright, so let's slow down a bit. First thing I do is I duplicate the collection. I do this because this is a destructive process. We'll be cutting up meshes, creating mesh trimmings, and I always like to have a clean collection of meshes that I could use in case I mess up. I'll just duplicate it again and start over. Now, in referencing this livery, I will duplicate the clean master mesh collection several times. I'll duplicate it to cut out the black stripes on the fuse. I will duplicate it again to cut out the red stripes on the fuse. I will do the same for the engine nacelles. I will duplicate it twice, 2 collections for the red and black on the tip tanks, and I'll also duplicate it to have a dedicated collection for the tail graphics. Now the main reason I do this is to minimize clutter in the outliner. As you trim meshes, you end up with new meshes with very similar names as the other meshes, and it can get confusing. By putting each in their own collection per cut, you minimize the number of meshes you have to look at, and it's just easier. I mistakenly duplicated the background image all those times, so I've since isolated that into just one background image at the bottom of the collection. So now what I do is remove all the meshes that aren't relevant to each collection. For example, the fuselage, I don't need items 3, 4, and 5. For the fuselage red, also, I do not need items 3, 4, and 5. So I'm going to delete those so I don't have to look at them in each level. I go through each collection that I've duplicated and I remove all the meshes that are not relevant to that particular cut. with all those meshes cleaned out, let's get started. We'll start with the fuselage. We're going to do the black stripes. Go to a side view. We'll turn on our background image, and we need our cutting shape, which is a Bezier. So I'll add the Bezier. And then the very first thing I do after I create a Bezier is I basically orient it in the side view that I need. I make it a 2D shape, and I set the resolution to 30. I use 30 for all my Beziers for these types of cuts. Now I'm going to turn on the handles for the moment. I'll probably turn them off in a little bit, which you'll see in a moment. All right, so once I have those in place, I want to make sure that they're on the right side of the aircraft, so my camera view, they don't get hidden by the fuselage body. So now I'm going to turn these Beziers, which are curved, into vector type, which means they're all straight, because I'm drawing only straight lines on this, right? So now you can see how these handles are in the way. It's hard to figure out which is an end point, which is a handle point. So now I'll turn the handles back off for the straight line type segments. If I was doing curves, I would turn the handles back on. So now I'm going to set about starting to trace this entire path. It takes a while. It's tedious. I use the X or the Y and Z command keys to translate and keep everything horizontal and vertical. So I'm going to trace this shape. Now as we come to the conclusion of this process and we're ready to complete the Bezier, we need to close the Bezier so that we can apply a fill to it. Now to close the Bezier in Blender, we select the Bezier, and then on the Bezier tab, we go to Active Spline, select the U checkbox under the cyclic. That will close the Bezier. Now that the Bezier is closed, it can be filled. In Blender, we fill a Bezier through the Shape tab. And in the Shape tab, there's a pull down for fill mode. There's several options, but we're going to want to set it to front. Now that you can see that it's filled. One thing I like to do is to change the color, and I use the object color. So you click on the Object tab, the Viewport Display Options, and you can select the object color. Now, in order to see the object color, you have to be in the object rendering mode. In addition, we could adjust the alpha if we would like to see through it just a little bit. Okay, so here I'm in a new Blender file that's organized better. The last demo I did where I created the Bezier shape, I did not have the organized outliner as I should have. So here we are, we're going to cut the black paint stripes into the fuselage. So if you look at my collection for the black fuselage, there's only 3 entities in here. We have the cutting shape and the 2 items that we're going to cut, objects 1001 and 1002. We're going to turn off 1002 because we don't need it for this cut. So here's the way we do it, and this is where all the magic happens. You can use this procedure to cut just about anything. So the procedure is select the object that you want to cut, tab into edit mode. Then in the outliner, and only in the outliner, control click the cutting shape so that they are now both highlighted in this manner. You should be in edit mode in the object that you want to cut, and your cutting object should be highlighted in orange. Okay. Now that that's done, we're going to execute the Blender command knife project. All right, and right at this moment we have cut out the mesh projecting through there. But you'll see right here you've got this checkbox, cut through. Most of the time we want to use cut through. There will be a situation in a little bit where I'm cutting the tail, and the numbers are swept back on one side, and on the other side they're swept back in the opposite direction. So in that example, we don't want to cut through the mesh. In this example, we do want to cut through the mesh. Now, with that done, if you look, you'll see that we have cut the mesh, and the mesh that has just been cut is highlighted. It's very critical. At this stage with it highlighted, hit the P key, and that is to separate the selection. So we have now just separated out the selected item. And by separating out the selected item, we've also created a new object here in our outliner. So it is currently selected, so now we want to name it. This is going to be let's see, object 1001 black paint region. All right. Okay. Now what we're going to do is we're going to do the same thing. We're going to turn off 001 and we're going to turn off 002 and we're going to turn off our newly trimmed object here. So now we're going to do the procedure just the same. We're going to get in the side view, select, tab, control click, knife project, cut through is still selected, enter, P to separate it, and we will tag it, and we will also name this, which is now object 1002 black paint region. Now you can delete these two meshes if you want. See, these are now trimmings. These really serve no purpose. Sort of. If you're keen, you'll notice that this door, right, has to be painted black as well. All right. So this is a kind of a special case. I'm gonna select all these guys because these need to be part of the black paint area. So I'm going to separate these out, okay, so, and I'm going to join him with this other piece. So now this all needs to be black, okay. Now with that done, you can delete these two if you want to, because you can see that these are worthless. This is trim left over, and it's just gonna confuse the outliner. So I'm going to delete these pieces here. Now you can see that these just need to be black. All right, so let's get them exported. You need to turn off your cut region. We don't need that. Let's export out 1001 first. We'll select it. We'll go into edit mode, and now we'll go to the UV tab, and you can see that we have this really beautiful UV map of this shape. All right, so all we do is highlight all of the UV maps. I don't know if you need to highlight, but I do. Go to UV, export UV layout. Make sure this is the side of your textures, 40 by 96, it usually is, 40 by 96. Let's give it a good name, which it should have already, object 1001 black paint region. I'm gonna preface this with UV region so that when it gets imported into GIMP, it'll take on this layer name. And I'm gonna export this out into the Livery project folder. Let that export out. Once that's done, over here, I'll just use this outliner that's over here. I'm going to turn that off, turn that on. I'm going to do the same thing over here. UV, export UV layout, 1002, black paint UV region, and export that out. And now I'm going to have these layers that I can bring into GIMP and trace. All right, here we are back in GIMP. So let's import these layers. These are the shapes that we need to trace. We trace these with a pen tool, color them black, and we're pretty much good to go. After about 25-30 minutes of drawing, these are all the pen paths in GIMP. We convert these closed pen paths to a selection. We simply fill the selection with a little bit less than black, turn on the layers that we want, export these two images out to the liveries folder, and this is what it looks like. Now you go back to Blender, you can duplicate your black cut and move it to the Object 3 collection where the wheel bulges are, and you can do the same thing again for those. The vertical stab is its own beast and probably the most difficult part, even more so than the tip tanks. So let's get this one cut. I've got it set up already. Here I've just added some text in Blender. Now text in Blender happens to be made out of Bezier curve, so we don't have to do anything. We just add the text, type in what we want, and we're good to go. Of course, with text and Blender, you can shear, you can swap the angle, so it's really handy to do these, shear them in different directions on either side of the tail. So you can see I have two text objects. So I have one here that's labeled the left side text, one's the right side text, and I have this Mitsubishi diamond symbol. Now this is just a regular mesh, okay? So, but in order to cut through another mesh, it has to be a closed region. You cannot do something like this and slice with, let's say, a shape like that. That won't slice. So it must be a closed mesh. So we're going to use the Mitsubishi diamond symbol, and we're going to cut all the way through the mesh with this shape. However, we're only going to cut one side only with each of these shapes. So let's get started. We're going to start here and cut the right side, and as before, select the mesh to be cut, go to edit mode, control click. This is the left side text. It highlights, knife project. There it is. Hit the P key. Uh-oh, I made a mistake. It's cut through. That means this is going to be cut through the other side, and we're going to have backwards text. We don't want to do that. So I just did undo. Let's do it again. Select, edit mode, left side text, knife project, enter, uncheck cut through. Now it's only cut through one side. Hit the P key to separate it. That side's done. Let's do this side. Select it, edit mode, right side text, knife project. I like to check it. Hit the P key, separate that mesh. That's done. Now let's do the Mitsubishi symbol. Select this guy, edit mode, the diamond symbol, select, knife project. This time we want to cut all the way through. There it is, that side. There it is, that side. And we're going to separate out the mesh. Now, I myself am just going to delete these messages that I don't need. You can save them if you want. It really doesn't matter. I'll delete these, and then I'm going to join all these together. All right, simply because I can go in edit mode, and here in the UV, you'll see that they're all ready to export. Now, if we examine these a little bit closer, you can see how difficult these shapes are. If we try to do these by hand, there's some real critical alignments. Now, there's still going to be some challenges that we're going to cover with a special technique, but by and large, you should export this out and trace it in Photoshop and at least get these shapes done. All right, here we are back in Blender, and there is a special technique that warrants its own mention, and that is object painting in Blender, almost the same as you can do in Substance. So to demonstrate that, I'm going to split this. I'm not going to go into the requirements of object painting. If you're interested in this, you need to look up the Blender documentation. Again, this is not a Blender tutorial. It's just a demonstration of the techniques that I use from time to time to paint liveries for X-Plane. I'm going to go to Shader Editor. The material for this item is already, it populated with the, when you imported the FBX, each object got its own material. I'm going to add a texture image node. I'm going to navigate to the livery folder, and I'm going to select the livery that I exported out from Photoshop for the tail, which I happen to know is Exterior 3. Okay? And there we are. We can see the texture on the tail because we are in texture rendering mode in Blender. Now, earlier in the video, I worked in object mode for object color when I was showing you the Bezier cuts. But for this, we're going to go into texture mode. Furthermore, there's lighting effects applied to this. So I like to go to flat color. So this is the raw color of the image. And there's a couple of benefits to doing that. So if we look at this tail, we can see, and we examine the quality of the output, we can see a problem right here in the number 5. There's a little gap here that didn't get painted. I don't know if it didn't get cut or if it got missed in the cut for whatever the reason. So when we examine this in Blender, we can see that this would be an extremely easy fix in Photoshop. In fact, the proper fix is probably to go back to Photoshop and just hand paint in this area that you see here. Now, we'll note that this little hump that you see here is basically what they call pixel padding. This keeps you from having cracks and seams at far camera distances. So when I'm tracing these UV maps with the pen tool in Photoshop or GIMP, then when I get to these polygons that are on the outside or they're on the edge of a seam or a cut, then they're going to have these padding areas. Then I'll actually trace these with the pen tool so as to include that in the fill. So that's what these funny little tabs are here and there. All right, but as far as painting goes right onto the model, it's as simple as going to texture paint mode. You can click on this, and then you can use the eyedropper tool to select a color. Now when you do this, you're not selecting the color from the object, you're actually selecting the color of the screen itself. In other words, I can come and select the green from this title bar if I wanted to. This is the reason that I use the flat as opposed to the studio. If I use the studio, I might be selecting a gray or a hue of red, and I don't want to do that. When I go to flat, I'm getting raw colors. This red is exactly the same as this red on the left side. So that being said, we could select that, select the red, and now I can just start painting right here and start fixing this if I wanted to. Now when I let go of the mouse, it then will update the texture here, right? So if I do this and let go, you can see it pop in. So this isn't a lesson in object painting in Blender. There are sophisticated techniques for masking the polygons that you want to paint on. There are ways to obviously change the radius of the brush, and there's actually quite a few powerful tools. But the point is that you can see how you can come in here and you could paint these areas in. Now I can apply the lighting effects now because I'm not interested in using the eyedropper tool. But now you can see how you can come in here and you can start cleaning up some of these areas. Now whether or not I'm going to clean up these areas using object paint here in Blender versus going back to Photoshop and fixing it there depends on the circumstance. To be honest, I don't use this tool a whole lot. It works for more organic shapes, or if I have to smooth over. Like a good example of where I may use this is if I'm doing straight lines on the tip tank and the cuts have resulted in some oddly funny, what I call hollow or concave areas, then you can come into these areas by hand and just ever so slightly touch them up to make the lines look a little straight. So this is very much a very fine-tuned technique that I use at the very end of a project, and not always. I like to bring my textures into Blender. I like to look over all of them and see the areas that need touch-up. Most of the time I have GIMP open at the same time, and I will observe the area in Blender, then I'll go to GIMP. I may tweak the curves a little bit, I may bow them out a little bit, or I just may grab a brush tool and hand paint the map a little bit. So I have all these tools at my disposal. The cutting of the mesh that this video has mostly been about gets me 98 to 99% of the way in painting my textures. The bulk of the work is then going into GIMP and hand tracing all those UV maps that you imported from those cut shapes, and then I may do my own hand painting at that point and then final touch up, and that's how I get my liveries. All right, so now you know how I paint liveries for this complex UV layout that's on the MU2. And if you've been wanting to paint liveries for the MU2 but found the UV layout too intimidating, I hope this video has provided a little bit of direction for you, and I hope that you can paint the liveries that you ultimately want to paint, and we look forward to seeing them. Good luck.